Hope things are well for you. Today is the 14th mini lecture on the Constitution. And in the last mini lecture, I talked about the compromises over slavery. And again, the two you should know for test purposes, the three-fifths compromise, where slaves would count as three-fifths of a free person for both taxation and representation, and that Congress could ban the importation of slaves after 1808. This next compromise isn't really discussed much in your textbook, but I think it's a really important one. And once again, the constitutional conflict over trade policy is an intriguing one that we do see resolved in the Constitution. You can get into a really intriguing and lengthy debate and discussion about whether or not a country should engage in free trade as a policy or whether a country should engage in protectionism. Now, one of the things that is very, very common in new countries or in poor countries is that they tend to want to protect their infant industries. They do not believe that they can compete with more developed societies that may have more up-to-date technology, for example, or a larger market, for example. And certainly this is a problem in the North. I talked about this earlier when I said that Northern industry began to develop to compete with the British during that action-reaction cycle to revolution. The problem, however, is that the Northern delegates understood that their merchants were at a competitive disadvantage with the Europeans, that European merchandise was cheaper, it was of higher quality, and that if consumers had the choice between better European goods or inferior, more expensive American goods, they were going to buy European goods overwhelmingly. And so if you look under number one, under trade, your notes read, Northerners wanted Congress to tax both imports and exports. So this was an attempt by Northern delegates to protect infant American industry and manufacturing for the Europeans, and that explains the import tax. The reason why they wanted an export tax is they understood that Southerners were going to be able to successfully sell goods, their agriculture, to European markets. That Southerners were going to be able to sell tobacco, Southerners were going to sell rice, and of course, most importantly, Southerners were going to be able to sell cotton. And so by having an export tax, the belief was that Southern plantation owners could pay for a lot of the government. Once again, do not think of this as a good thing or a bad thing. Northerners are trying to write rules of the game to benefit themselves. So they're egoistic, not necessarily good or bad. Now, Southerners wanted to advocate free trade for two reasons. One, through free trade, Southern consumers could buy European merchandise cheaper, get higher quality merchandise. So by not having an import tax, Southern consumers would benefit from the lack of a tax. Obviously, Southerners did not want an export tax because they did not want their goods to cost more when they reached European markets for fear that the Europeans might find another supplier of those items. So in this particular case, we have a situation of self-interest. The Southerners were also concerned about the import tax because the Southern contention was that if Congress taxed European merchandise being imported into the United States, then the Europeans would tax European agriculture being imported into Europe, and that this would prompt widespread trade wars And of course, the danger of really hostile trade wars is that they could escalate potentially into military conflict. And certainly, there were a lot of delegates concerned about perhaps another European war. And what if, in this particular case, not only England was upset by this, but other European uh, markets and countries, and they refused to help the United States if they got into a war, for example, with Britain. Now, even though Northerners wanted to tax both imports and exports, the major thing that the Northerners wanted was that import tax. They wanted to make sure that they could protect their merchants from European competition. And even though in an ideal world, Southerners did not want Congress to tax either imports or exports, the Southern emphasis was on the export tax. The last thing they wanted was for our government to tax Southern agriculture and then that agriculture to be imported into Europe and then the Europeans tax them again, making their goods totally non-competitive against other countries' agriculture. So the only exam question that will appear on the exam related to trade is at the bottom of your notes. It is underlined. The famous compromise that you should be aware of for test purposes is that Congress can tax imports, and certainly they did. I have found import taxes in American history as high as 1,100% at one time, shortly before the Great Depression. But Congress cannot tax exports. So Congress can tax imports, but not exports. And so that is the famous compromise on trade. We now turn to the next item in the half of the mini lecture that I have left. I've used this phrase many times, but if you take a look at the constitutional system, at its very heart is power fragmentation. There are 5 fundamental ways that political power is fragmented in the Constitution. And so the obvious prerequisite question, the obvious question is, why was power fragmentation at the heart of the constitutional system? Besides the fact that you know that this notion of separation of powers and checks and balances was stolen from Montesquieu. So if you follow along in your notes, I have written down my second favorite political quotation. My favorite political quotation is by Al Capone. Al Capone, of course, is not thought of as a political theorist. He was a gangster in Chicago. But Al Capone's famous saying was, "A smile will get you a lot, but a smile and a gun will get you a whole lot more," which is probably true in the short run, but in the long run, people who tend to use guns often end up with one being inflicted on them. So in your notes, I have my second favorite quote by James Madison. He wrote this in the Federalist Papers. It's underlined, and it's a very simple, it's very straightforward, but it says a lot with a little. And the quote is, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." I think this is an incredibly effective summary of social contract theory and explains the rationale for government. To summarize the discussion of social contract theory when I talked about Hobbes and Locke and Montesquieu, the argument is simply we're better off with government than without it. And while we can have a reasonable debate about whether people are basically good or basically evil, we're not angels, we're not perfect. And of course, the social contract theorists argue that without government, our deficiencies as people would be magnified. In other words, our imperfections would stand out and manifest themselves. The social contract theorists also make the assumption that we cannot change our basic human nature, that the things that motivated us centuries ago motivate us today and will potentially motivate us in centuries to come. And so Madison's assumption, and the assumption of most social contract theorists, is that the very best that we can hope for is to devise a government that takes into our account our human nature. We can't change our human nature, but let us build a government that works with that human nature and not against it. So if it is true, and I believe that it is, that men are egoistic, that men are driven by selfish interests, then it's logical and it makes sense that we would create a government that fragments our base motivation for power, that we would create a government that checks power with power and ambition with ambition. And so Madison believes that the Constitution, in selling the Constitution in the Federalist Papers, that we have created a government that truly understands what human motivation is, takes it into account, and that this is perhaps the very, very best that we can hope for. Now, if you take a look, there are five ways that power is fragmented in the Constitution. I will go through them very, very quickly in the 3 minutes and a half that I have left in this mini lecture. You can read them for yourself, but obviously the first one is separation of powers. That in the American political system, individuals can only serve in one institution at a time. So when Barack Obama became our president, he gave up his Senate seat to become president. You can only serve as an executive officer, a legislative officer, or a judicial officer. And notice that all of them have different tenures. House members serve 2 years, presidents 4 years, senators 6 years. They have different constituencies. A House member often represents part of a state, a senator a whole state, Supreme Court justices and the president the whole country. Now, if you take a look at Great Britain does not have separation of powers. Great Britain has a fusion of power. So their Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson, Boris Johnson, is not only the chief executive of the country, but he is also a member of the legislature. He is a member of the House of Commons, which would be their legislature. So in the British model, there is a fusion of power. People play both executive and legislative roles. In the United States, that is specifically forbidden. Second, checks and balances. A lot of people think that checks and balances and separation of powers are the same thing. They certainly tend to go together, but they are very distinct notions. And by checks and balances, what we mean are that national institutions can check one another. So when Congress passes a law, the president can check that with a veto. The Congress and the president can work together. The Congress can move a bill to the president's desk. The president can sign it into law. But the Supreme Court can use judicial review and say that law is illegal. It is unconstitutional. Presidents can nominate Supreme Court justices, but the Senate can say, no, we do not approve of this president's Supreme Court nominee. And there are a whole variety of other checks and balances that do exist in the Constitution. In the next mini lecture, I will talk about federalism, bicameral equality, republicanism, and begin the debate over why the Constitution should be passed or not. And we will get into that in the next mini lecture. Again, I hope these lectures are making sense, that I'm not going too quickly. Please make sure to email me, give me some feedback, let me know what you think. Have a wonderful day, everyone. See you soon.